do one thing I was thinking to do at the beginning is just to conduct a straw poll. Just curious to see, first of all, how many people here have a professional or academic interest in social psychology? One. Two? Okay. How many people here have heard of the Milgram experiment? The Stanford prison experiment. The Robbers Cave, Sheriff Robbers Cave experiment. Bobo doll test. Okay, but despite only 2 of you having a professional interest in social psychology, it seems that these experiments, at least a few of the most sensational ones, are very widely diffused. That there's what you could call a vulgar fascination or a popular fascination. No, I mean not vulgar. Vulgar is like vernacular, a popular fascination in them, and I think that fascination is one of the things that I'm fascinated with.
Maybe I can start by asking Rod something that struck me a lot in the clip that you just showed. And it has to do with time and kind of the relationship with history, which all of you are dealing with various aspects. And it was something that David Koresh said, actually, on the tape. And he means something else when he says this, but he says, you don't understand what time you're in. And he's talking about kind of apocalyptic Christianity, but there's another way we could think about that in terms of his position in history. And I think I'd be curious what all of you think about this moment of kind of putting history into the reenactment. So here you have this replaying of this message. Kind of David Koresh is actually speaking from the grave already. He's already historicizing himself. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the reaction of the people who were actually participating in your reenactment, who were hearing these statements. I mean, do you see an interesting link there between history per se and the way that Koresh is sort of already historicizing?
Well, I suppose the way I kind of want to sort of extend it out a bit more actually than just Koresh specifically, because the thing that really interests me is a way of using the sense of moments in the past to speak about the present. That there's a way in which events happen in certain frameworks in certain ways historically that reoccur in moments in the present, often in kind of troubled ways that are actually quite difficult to speak about. So I think it's a useful. So in that sense, I think that idea of displacement in history is a useful tool, really, to access dialogues that are difficult. I mean, obviously the dialogues that I've focused on, particularly the Milgram experiment and this piece, in a sense they already embody sort of historical difficulties in themselves. But that actually I think helps them then kind of mediate the present, because they're already problematized. There's already not a straightforward account, or at least the account of it is subject to speculation and disagreement. So that's, for me, that also aids the way in which their staging becomes very clear, very foreground, which is also really interesting.
I think also one thing that the Koresh, that dialogue that outlined, is this idea that really it highlights something that's probably always the case, is that when we make historical narratives of things, we indeed do always make them historical narrative thing. It's very heightened indeed when an apocalyptic Christian, you know what I mean, tries to articulate their narrative of what the present constitutes. So I think that's another thing that happens with that piece. And it is this thing of time folding back on itself, which again isn't a reoccurring thing, I think, in your work.
Yeah, there's a very important moment actually in the piece of work where you get these audible date stamps, and the date stamps are the date stamps when these sounds were being played. So the audience is sort of informed basically of this sort of moment.
was reading recently Philip Lejeune on autobiography, and he was discussing the way in which the unwritten autobiography projects backwards its generic imperatives on the life. So the life is lived in relation to its as yet unwritten autobiography. And I think in this kind of case where there's already a telos, right? I mean, literally a clearly defined telos, a spectacular telos, then this kind of spectacular event is staged in the projection or the retro projection of that spectacular telos. And so, in fact, the future and the present are collapsed, in a sense, into a historical script which gives meaning to time, to history, to movement, to all those kinds of distinctions that can be made and is collapsed. And people here are quite clearly performing in that historical role. They're performing a historical script explicitly, a divinely inspired historical script. And I think that's kind of just graphic, but I think it's a more pervasive condition, and the autobiography is kind of emblem of that pervasive condition.
It's also a script that inevitably ends badly, which is something occurring already.
How about the fact that the mindset of the people who are in the stadium is so completely different from the people who are in the Waco complex?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, they know the voice of Koresh, they know what he means, they know his when he speaks of time, he know what time he means.
Yeah.
So in this way, is there what is the synchronicity between those two
I mean,
events?
in a sense, the synchronicity is difficult. I mean, you could argue there is no synchronicity.
Yeah.
That, and I think I think you can, in a sense, argue that as a kind of more general point about the construction of history. That history is always constructed in the present for the people that construct it at that moment. I mean, that's something that someone like R.G. Collingwood's, theory of sort of history as reenactment for the historian. Not for the proper methodology of the historian is to reenact an event, which is this kind of proposal way back in something like 1946. Is a model for exactly what you're describing, really, that history only exists in that kind of asynchronous sort of way. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense in which, I kind of enjoy that, really. I think that's an interesting position to begin with. And there's not a sense in which, obviously, I'm expecting people in this piece to somehow have the same experience as the Davidians in Waco. Of course not, but in fact, actually, I think probably more likely they're going to be thinking about, the surroundings that they're in, their present context, rather than the kind of historical one. I don't really know, but.
Why did you decide not to make up new rules for hierarchy, just to kind of take the rules that existed already and reuse them?
When you say rules, you mean the
like rules or conditions, like the FBI that reduced the sound. What was this decision? Why?
Well, but there's the other element about the work as well is that there's a sort of, I'm interested in a kind of a sort of documentary impulse in the work as well, where it is actually about imparting information as well. That it's and it is about, in some sense, recording something or fixing something in some sort of temporary kind of way.
That's why you're saying it's not about experience.
Well, that's the funny thing. I mean, obviously, obviously that film doesn't articulate to you what it was like, but it was very loud, very visceral experience. Most people there, you can see, had earplugs in that were given to them by the St John's Ambulance that we had, who were a kind of volunteer doctors sort of organisation that came to the event. So, I mean, I'm interested in that sort of tension between the viscerality of its staging and then the kind of informative, informational aspect of its staging as well, and the kind of collision between those two things. They sort of, I think they throw you out and they make a new space, a different kind of space, actually. So it's not about trying to just repeat the old rules. It's about trying to somehow obstruct something else, another space.
It seems to me that in the Milgram, the compliance that Rod is re-rehearsing with his actors, the compliance to the instructions to electrocute somebody, the compliance with that process fundamentally undermines the identity of those participating until they do things which, if you ask them on the street beforehand, would you ever do that? They say absolutely not. I wouldn't shock somebody to the extent of their life. Whereas if you look to the Waco one, just rehearing all of the language and the bargaining going on between the two, it really struck me kind of like a John Wayne type fulfillment of complicity with their own identities. I am the apocalyptic hero of this religion, he is my enemy. I am the defender of the American way, he is my enemy. We are going to go through this, and they're actually complying with their own set of conditions. And there we are, the audience that Rod has formulated, wandering around in this massive, massive racetrack with the sound being bombarded at us. But we are complying with our identities as fashionable ICA art attenders. We kind of put up with it. And that's it. This is very unformed, but I find it quite interesting that in that one, everyone starts conforming, complying, signing those ridiculous forms that he did. And I was not collaborating with him, I was a punter. I didn't realise he was going to do any of this. And I don't know, feedback, I'm just finding that that's what's beginning to emerge. Is what is the bargain in compliance? Does it make you feel this is where I am in life, or is there another kind of compliance which is explicit in the Milgram, which is to undermine, but maybe it actually takes you to where you want to be? I don't know, I'll stop. That was a request. That's going to support science. I was going to wait for a little while.
The historical trajectories are exactly as you described. They were exactly that. The FBI's, in that particular instance in Waco, what the FBI did was an absolute fulfillment of the Davidians' prophecy. There were people who tried to tell them that that was the case, and that the result of this would be apocalypse for the Davidians. So the trajectory of the narratives that you describe is absolutely on the nail. And obviously, the other thing about staging these things is that, I think the level of compliance by the audience it isn't really compliance. It is actually self-conscious role play. So there's a different kind of compliance. I don't think we should get them too confused, really. And Michael and I have been talking about this recently, about these kind of, where do we demark these lines where, for instance, a reality TV contestant is in a particular kind of compliance space, and a psychology experiment subject is also in a particular kind of compliance space. And where do those spaces stop and start, and how are they defined, and how are they monitored, and what kind of feedback do we get from them, what kind of data do we get back from them? And how useful is that? I don't want to propose I have all the answers to that, but they're kind of interesting. They're interesting things to think about. Where will these spaces begin and end in our everyday lives, and in our kind of institutional lives, and in our legal lives?
And the maintenance of subjectivity within these systems.
Let's take one more question from Anke, and then we'll break.
It kind of links quite neatly with what you just ended with, Rod, and somehow is there in between compliance and autobiography. And it was in relation to your talk, Steve, that I started wondering that on the one hand, when we talk about Waco or Milgram, we're actually talking about social studios that are quite extreme, and that are also quite extreme in a way that they tend towards people being subjected to the power of those mechanisms. So you have the subjected and you have the subjectors. This is even reflected in the terminology of a servo system, where somebody is apparently servile, servant, I don't know what the right word is.
A robot means
to something else.
Indeed,
yes. At the same time, though, I was wondering that once we end up with a model like reality TV, I think we have to start talking perhaps about the desire of the participants to be part of the social studio, whether to shape it or to be in it, or even contemporary, let's say the predominant mode of psychotherapy is behavioral therapy. It's kind of the desire to be that individual that can become a blank slate and that then can redesign or reprogram itself. So I was wondering what kind of space you see there from the kind of extreme example of something like Waco to this very prevalent, perhaps everyday desire to be in the social studio, not as a servant subjected to it against their will, but as somebody who wants to be in that position.
Yeah. May I? Yeah, go ahead. I think that the idea of the self-performing subject is actually, you could actually see these rather extreme ones as a sort of, almost a superstructure of something that prevails in every day. So we don't see our own circumstances as a sort of social studio, but in a sense it would be possible to see it like that. And I think it's the instrument, it's the day-to-day, almost ant-like progression of our each moments of self-performance that actually form the base of an economy, the superstructure of which is celebrity, I think. That's how I look at that question.
Yes, Rod has
yeah, I mean, I was just going to sort of echo a little bit what Steve was saying. In a way, they are, obviously they're extreme examples, and they're almost kind of, they almost sort of construct a, I mean, particularly the Milgram experiment, they kind of construct a template that, other things can be modelled or driven from. But also, there's a kind of argument that, and Michael might want to say something about this as well, there's an argument that as well, that in a sense they actually just act out a narrative that's already prescribed. So they kind of, they are, after all, they are about demonstrating and proving a hypothesis. So they start with the idea to at least to a certain extent, if not completely. They start with a certain extent with that hypothesis that is then going to be demonstrated.
Could I just come back to Andrew's point, Michael, because I derailed myself over it. And so I think it's a question that I can't answer, but to that question about the degree to which we are complicit ourselves in that, do we re-excavate or do we sort of revive notions of bad faith? An old Marxist notion that we live in, that we live in complicity and we live in bad faith in a society respectable, so to speak, where we consume media, or is there another way of looking at that relation to essentially a relation to celebrity, because that's the kind of mark that through the self-performance, everyday self-performance, which I mean things like being on MySpace or using email, these are all kind of tiny little particles of this structure. Whether something else is actually at play, and I suspect I wouldn't go for the bad faith option, but I haven't read yet. I don't think in this circumstance I can articulate what the alternative is to that. But it is something that is a much more mobile than being a kind of a robot indeed, who just consumes a pre-digested media. Yeah.
On the relationships between complicity and compliance and subjectivity and subjection, I think it's worth noting that none of these classic popular social psychology experiments would be possible today. That after the institutional review boards in the 80s and the ethical procedures, the ethical review procedures that came in partly in the wake of these experiments, you wouldn't be able to do the kinds of things that you can do in an art piece. So it's interesting that you can rehearse, you can restage these social psychology experiments in a gallery. You can subject people in certain ways in a gallery that you wouldn't be able to in a laboratory. And that's curious, and it's curious not least because the experiments themselves are academic commonplaces. They're still taught. The experiments are still taught, and we still suppose that they offer us some kind of epistemological leverage, that they were carried out in the service of some greater knowledge. Whereas, you know, it's really, and this is something we've been discussing, questionable about, while clearly they're humanly relevant in as much as people find them engaging and fascinating, it's really questionable whether, despite being successes as ethical dramas or morality plays, whether they have any kind of empirical purchase, whether they actually discover or deduce anything, or whether they simply demonstrate a proverb or a shared sense about the human condition, whether they offer us a spectacle through which we're able, in the idiom of the empirical, to discuss kinds of behaviour and forms of subjection that we wouldn't be allowed to do in broader social space and no longer within the confined space of the laboratory.
So, can I just ask, and this is really a neutral question, but I think Rod is the person who actually organised it, I take it, rather than me. What the Waco or the Milgram station, the data, Waco could repeat itself. What's your ethical position? Did you have any ethical second thoughts about doing it?
About doing the Waco?
Yeah, or I mean Milgram, I think because of the fact that there was this ethical board, this ethical review procedure was sent, it was no longer
just on a point of clarity. So I didn't restage Milgram's experiment as an experiment. What I did was I had actors play roles from the transcripts. So it was a kind of, you know, a facsimile.
And what's that because I'm trying to get at
the reason that
whether you have any ethical stake in this at all.
Well, the reason I did that wasn't actually for ethical reasons. There were other reasons why I was interested in doing that, about exploring ideas about mediation. That was my interest in doing that. With the Waco one, no, I don't think I did have any ethical worries about it, because actually I thought that I wasn't going to subject anyone actually to anything that was really going to be very, very difficult for them to cope with.
But that was presumably Stanley Milgram's original assessment. I mean, he would have said something similar. He would also say.
Well, the interesting. Well, I mean, you know, just again on a sort of historical point, the interesting thing about Stanley Milgram is actually the thing. Ironically, the thing that upset him the most about doing that experiment was the lack of effect that it had on the people that took part in it 6 months later. And so the weird thing was that actually, yes, he did have concerns, and they weren't borne out. And I think that was the thing he found most. The thing he found most depressing about the experiment wasn't actually the results, wasn't a high level of compliance, but it was the fact that actually 6 months on, people just kind of said, well, yeah, I did this, fine, so what? You know, it has no. I don't even think about it now.
Well, actually,
so it's complicated in terms of, you know, that.
I mean, lots of actually some of the subjects from the Milgram experiment actually reported positively. They said, "Oh, it gave me such an insight."
Exactly.
Some became conscientious objectors, and we get now more afterwards. Not so with the Zimbardo experiment, where people did in fact suffer permanent trauma, and you know. But here, the argument made is the same kind of argument that journalists make in terms of like breach of confidence for the overwhelming public good. It's like these experiments, the possible harm to individual subjects is outweighed because of the insight it gives us, the valuable knowledge, the empirical leverage that it offers us. And you know, that's really questionable, and I think you can level at these experiments the same kinds of questions that you can level at some of the artworks downstairs. You know, like, what does it mean to reinscribe a 92-year-old Auschwitz survivor with his tattoo when he's reluctant? What is gained? What knowledge, what insight, what new ethical spaces opened up? So yeah, I think these ethical questions are precisely tied to questions of aesthetics and epistemology, and the more so because these social psychology experiments were explicitly predicated on what they called the dramaturgical method. They were dramas, and they were staged as dramas. So yeah.
we'll be picking that up. I know there are more questions, but I would suggest we seize the opportunity to take a short break because there's another seminar session.
Another 2 hours to go.
I think that's short. I think that's short to go.
Yeah, and we would take around 10 minutes and then invite everyone to go upstairs and have a drink, and then we reconvene and turn the floor back over to Rod.